The morning sun cast long shadows across the tarmac at Naval Air Station Kingsville, a military installation nestled in the flat Texas landscape about an hour from the Gulf of Mexico. The base was quiet that November day, the kind of quiet that comes before something important. Inside Hangar 7, the routine was exactly as it had been for the past 3 months since Captain Sarah Chen arrived for her new posting. Sarah was 37 years old, with dark hair pulled back in regulation style and eyes that seemed to hold 1,000 stories. She had been a naval aviator for 14 years. 14 years of early mornings, of pushing herself beyond what she thought possible, of making split-second decisions that meant life or death. Her service record was exceptional. Her kill count as a fighter pilot, targets neutralized during combat operations, was among the highest in the current fleet. This was not something she celebrated or talked about. To Sarah, it was simply her job, her duty. But everyone at Kingsville knew her statistics. The pilots whispered about her in the ready room. The mechanics who worked on her aircraft knew her reputation. Even the administrative staff, the people who processed paperwork and schedules, knew that Captain Sarah Chen was not someone to underestimate in the sky. What they didn't know was how she spent her quiet evenings alone in her small apartment off base, in a town called Corpus Christi, 30 minutes away. They didn't know that she wrote letters to the families of the people she had lost under her command. They didn't know that she donated half her salary to military charities that helped wounded veterans. They didn't know that she had turned down promotions twice, because accepting them would have meant leaving her squadron, and she felt responsible for the young pilots under her command. They only saw the numbers, the name, the reputation. On this particular morning, Sarah was in the briefing room, reviewing flight data with 2 of her younger pilots, Lieutenant Marcus Webb and Lieutenant Jennifer Torres. They were preparing for a training exercise scheduled for that afternoon. Marcus was talented but sometimes reckless. Jennifer was steady and smart, the kind of pilot who would go far if she stayed focused. "Captain, we got the preliminary weather report," Jennifer said, pointing to her tablet. "Winds are going to be stronger than they predicted. We might want to adjust the formation parameters." Sarah leaned over and studied the data. Jennifer was right. She had good instincts. "Good catch," Sarah said. "Let's brief the rest of the squadron on this. I want everyone thinking about wind shear today." Marcus spoke up. "Captain, I was wondering if, well, I heard that you're supposed to meet with Admiral Hargrove today. Is that true?" Sarah's jaw tightened slightly. She had been dreading this meeting all week. "Yes, after lunch. Just a routine check-in with the new wing commander." What she didn't say was that she had heard the rumors. Admiral James Hargrove was new to the command, transferred from the Pentagon just 6 weeks ago. He had a reputation for being old school, traditional, and there were whispers that he wasn't particularly happy about the number of women in positions of authority within his command. At 56 years old, he had come up through the Navy during a different era. He had served with distinction, everyone said. But he was also known for his sharp tongue and his casual dismissal of what he called modern sensitivity. Sarah had been avoiding him as much as possible, which was hard when he was the commanding officer of the entire wing. But she knew it was only a matter of time before they had to have a real conversation. After the briefing, Sarah grabbed a cup of black coffee and sat alone in her small office, barely bigger than a closet, but it was hers. She looked at the photos on her wall. One showed her young squadron standing in front of a fighter jet, everyone grinning at the camera. Another showed her with her parents at her academy graduation. A third was just her, in full flight gear, looking serious and focused. The knock on the door came at 12:30. "Captain Chen," it was one of Admiral Hargrove's aides, a young ensign who looked nervous. "The Admiral is ready for you." Sarah stood, straightened her uniform, and checked her appearance in the small mirror by the door. Everything was perfect. It always was. The Admiral's office was impressive, larger than most, with windows that overlooked the runways. Admiral Hargrove sat behind a massive wooden desk that had probably been issued to him when he was promoted. He was a big man, broad-shouldered, with steel-gray hair and the kind of permanent tan that came from years of being outdoors. He was reading something on his computer, and he didn't look up immediately when Sarah entered. This was a power move. Sarah recognized it. She waited, standing at attention. Finally, after several seconds, Hargrove looked up. "Captain Chen, come in, sit down." He gestured to a chair across from his desk. Sarah sat, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. She had learned long ago how to be a stone when she needed to be. "How are you settling in?" The Admiral asked, his tone casual. Very well, sir. Thank you for asking. My squadron is performing excellently. Yes, I've read your reports. Very impressive numbers. He leaned back in his chair, studying her. Your kill count is remarkable, highest we've had in years among active pilots. I'm just doing my job, sir. Of course you are. He smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. You know, when I was starting out, we didn't have women in the cockpits. Things have changed quite a bit. Sarah said nothing. She had learned that sometimes silence was the best response. It's good that you're here, he continued. Gives the younger pilots something to look up to, shows that hard work and dedication matter. He paused. Even if you do have an unfair advantage. Sarah's eyes flickered. Sir. Nothing against you personally, he said quickly, holding up his hand. But we all know that the new jets, the updated targeting systems, the improved technology, it makes things easier than it used to be. Back in my day, we didn't have computers doing half the work for us. Sarah took a slow breath through her nose. She had heard this before from other officers, older men who couldn't accept that times had changed. With respect, sir, the targeting systems are the same ones our male pilots use. We all fly the same jets. The only difference is that I have more combat hours than most of them. Hargrove's eyes narrowed slightly. He didn't like being corrected. I'm not criticizing you, Captain. I'm just making an observation. You're a capable pilot. But let's keep things in perspective. The meeting lasted another 15 minutes. It was all surface-level talk. Nothing that could be reported to anyone, nothing that could be called outright discriminatory. But Sarah understood the message. The Admiral had already decided who she was and what she had accomplished. And in his mind, her achievements were somehow less real, less earned, than those of the men around her. When she left his office, Sarah walked directly to the bathroom in the hallway. She locked the door, stood at the sink, and looked at herself in the mirror. Her face was expressionless, but her hands were shaking. She closed her eyes and counted to 10, the way she always did when she needed to regain control. Then she splashed cold water on her face, dried it carefully, and returned to her duties. No one could know that anything was wrong. No one could see her doubt herself. She was Captain Sarah Chen. She had earned every single one of those numbers that frightened and impressed people in equal measure. But as she walked back across the tarmac toward the hangar, Sarah felt something shift inside her. A resolve beginning to harden into something sharper, something more dangerous than it had ever been before. The Admiral had just made a mistake. He had shown his hand too early, and Sarah Chen never forgot when someone underestimated her. 2 weeks later, the entire wing was assembled in the main auditorium for a monthly meeting. These events were mandatory. Every pilot, every engineer, every support staff member was expected to attend. The auditorium was packed, nearly 300 people filling the rows of seats. The chatter was loud, the way it always was before official business began. Admiral Hargrove took the stage at exactly 2 o'clock. He was in a good mood. Sarah could tell by the way he walked, the relaxed set of his shoulders. He had just returned from Washington, where he had apparently been briefed on some new initiatives the Navy was implementing. He spent the first 20 minutes discussing logistics, new training protocols, and budget allocations. His voice was confident, authoritative. This was a man who enjoyed being in charge. Then he said something that made the entire room tense. Before I finish up, I want to recognize some of our outstanding personnel, he began, smiling. We have some remarkable pilots in this wing, and I mean remarkable. Captain Chen, specifically, has an exceptional record. Sarah's stomach twisted. She could feel every eye in the room turning toward her. She was sitting in the middle of the section reserved for officers, surrounded by her peers. Captain Chen's kill count is the highest we've seen in years, Hargrove continued. Nearly double some of her colleagues. It's really something. There was some applause. Sarah didn't move, didn't acknowledge it. I have to say, Captain, Hargrove went on, addressing her directly now, when I first reviewed your file, I thought there might be some mistake. Those numbers seemed too high, so I had my staff verify them, and they're accurate. You really are that good. He paused, and his face shifted into a grin. I guess we should be grateful that all you've killed is the enemy. With numbers like that, it's lucky you're on our side and not the other way around. The auditorium erupted in laughter. Not cruel laughter, exactly. More the kind of nervous laughter that people make when an authority figure makes a joke that's just slightly inappropriate, and everyone is trying to decide if they should find it funny. Sarah's hands, which had been resting on the arms of her chair, gripped the plastic so hard that her knuckles went white. In fact, Hargrove continued, clearly enjoying himself, maybe we should watch out around Captain Chen, make sure we don't end up on her target list. What do you think, Captain? Should we be worried? Everyone was waiting for Sarah's response. Everyone wanted to see how the celebrated female pilot would respond to a joke about her being a killer. Everyone wanted to know if she had a sense of humor about her own deadly efficiency. The movement was slow and deliberate. She was wearing her dress uniform, which fit her perfectly, every button precisely in place. She was calm. She was controlled. She was a volcano that had been dormant for 14 years, and it was finally deciding to erupt. She walked toward the stage. No one stopped her. No one moved. The entire auditorium seemed to hold its breath. When she reached the stage, Hargrove's smile faltered slightly. He wasn't expecting her to come forward. He was expecting her to laugh it off, to make some self-deprecating comment to play along. Sarah climbed the stairs and stood next to him. She was 6 inches shorter than he was, but in that moment she seemed to tower over him. "Admiral," she said, her voice clear and carrying through the silent room, "you want to know who I should really be worried about?" Hargrove's jaw clenched. "Captain." "Let me answer," Sarah interrupted, her voice steady and controlled. "The people I should be worried about are the officers in charge of strategic decisions who don't understand the cost of those decisions. The commanders who see the numbers, the kill counts, the success rates, the tactical victories, and forget about what's underneath them. The human cost, the weight that each of those numbers carries." She turned to face the audience. "Every single number in my record represents a moment where I had to make a decision, execute it perfectly, and then live with the consequences. Some of those targets were military installations. Some were vehicles, but there were people involved, people with families, people who were told they were doing the right thing, just like I was told I was doing the right thing." She turned back to Hargrove. "You know what I'm really worried about, sir? I'm worried about leaders who make jokes about kill counts as if they're baseball statistics, who treat warfare like it's entertainment, who underestimate the people who actually have to carry the weight of those decisions, day after day, night after night." She looked out at the auditorium, at the faces of her squadron members, the support staff, the mechanics and technicians who made everything possible. "I've served this country for 14 years, she said, "and I've trained every pilot in this wing to make the best tactical decisions they can based on the intelligence available to them. I don't celebrate the kill counts. I minimize them. I find ways to accomplish missions with the least amount of loss. That's what I actually do." She looked back at Hargrove. "And if you don't understand the difference between respecting expertise and mocking the hard choices that expertise requires, sir, then I'm concerned about your ability to lead people who have to make those choices every single day." For a moment, there was no sound in the auditorium at all. It was the kind of silence that comes before a storm, the kind of silence that happens when something fundamental has shifted. Then Sarah walked off the stage. She walked back to her seat, past the shocked faces of her colleagues, and she sat down. The meeting ended 5 minutes later. No one was really listening to what Hargrove said. Everyone was thinking about what Sarah had said. Everyone was replaying it in their minds, deciding what it meant, deciding where they stood. Admiral Hargrove left the stage with his jaw clenched and his face still red. The rumor mill at Naval Air Station Kingsville, which normally moved at the speed of sound, moved even faster that day. By the time Sarah made it back to her office, everyone on the base knew what had happened. Some people thought she was brave. Some people thought she was insubordinate. Some people, mostly the younger pilots and the support staff, thought she was the most impressive thing they had ever seen. Sarah didn't think about any of that. She sat at her desk, closed her door, and let herself shake for exactly 5 minutes. Then she pulled herself together because that's what she had always done. What she didn't know was that her words had been recorded. One of the junior pilots had been live-streaming the meeting on her personal Instagram account, something that was technically against regulations, but that everyone did anyway. Within hours, the video had been shared in military forums, on social media, and across dozens of Navy-related networks. By 6 o'clock that evening, Admiral Hargrove's joke had been seen by over 100,000 people. Sarah was not naive. She had been in the military long enough to understand how things worked. Speaking out against a commanding officer, even when you were right, even when that commanding officer was in the wrong, had consequences. The first consequence arrived in the form of a formal inquiry. 3 days after the auditorium incident, Sarah was called into an office in the administration building. Captain William Rodriguez, the wing's chief of staff, was waiting for her. William was a good man, someone Sarah had worked with for years. He looked uncomfortable. "Sarah, sit down," he said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "What's this about?" Sarah asked, though she already knew. "The Admiral has filed a formal complaint about your behavior during the meeting. He says you were insubordinate, that you spoke out of turn, and that you disrespected his authority in front of the entire wing." Sarah's hands were steady. "I responded to a question he asked me directly." "You also made accusations," William said carefully, reading from a document in front of him. "You suggested that the Admiral doesn't understand the gravity of military operations. You questioned his fitness for leadership." "I questioned the wisdom of his approach, yes." William sighed and set the document down. "Look, I'm going to be honest with you because I respect you. The video went viral. Someone recorded it and posted it online. There are now," he checked his computer, "approximately 2 million views, and the response has been mixed. About 70% of the comments support what you said. Navy veterans, active duty personnel, military families, they're all saying that you were right, that Hargrove was out of line." "And the other 30%, Sarah asked. "Says you were insubordinate, that you should be court-martialed, that this is what's wrong with the modern Navy." Sarah absorbed this information. She had been careful in what she said. She hadn't cursed. She hadn't been emotionally out of control. She had made her points clearly and with evidence. "What happens now?" she asked. "There's going to be a formal review, not a court-martial, not yet, but an official investigation into the incident. The Navy's Public Affairs Office is already involved. This has become bigger than just you and the Admiral." Over the next 2 weeks, Sarah went through her life with an eerie sense of normalcy. She still flew her training missions. She still briefed her pilots. She still did her job with the same excellence she had always shown. But now everyone was watching her. The other officers seemed to avoid her or go out of their way to be extra professional. The younger pilots and support staff went out of their way to be supportive. The investigation began with formal interviews. Sarah was asked to give her account of what happened, to explain her state of mind, to discuss any previous conflicts with the Admiral. She answered everything honestly and without emotion. Then came the testimony from others, pilots who had heard the Admiral's dismissive comments in earlier meetings, support staff who had witnessed his eye-rolling comments about women in leadership, and most damaging, 3 female officers from his previous command who came forward with accounts of his patterns of behavior. Comments about their appearance, dismissals of their accomplishments, suggestions that they didn't have what it took to be real naval officers. The picture that emerged was not flattering to Admiral Hargrove. The turning point came when one of his senior staff members, a captain named Lisa Morrison, requested to give testimony in private to the investigation committee. What she revealed shocked everyone. Admiral Hargrove had a personal journal, nothing fancy, just a leather-bound book that he kept in his desk. Somehow, Lisa had access to it. She had read it, and she brought copies of the most damaging passages to the investigation. In the journal, Hargrove had written extensively and in shocking detail about his feelings toward women in the military. He believed they were less capable than men, less emotionally suited for combat, and that their presence in the Navy was undermining military readiness. He had written about his meeting with Sarah, and he had recorded his impression of her as all statistics and no soul, someone who was playing at being a soldier, but didn't have the real warrior spirit that men possessed. Most damaging of all, he had written about his intention to build a case against Sarah. He wanted to document every mistake, every moment of weakness, every indication that she was unsuitable for command. He was planning to use those notes to eventually remove her from her position. When the investigation committee read those passages, the entire dynamic shifted. Admiral James Hargrove was suspended from duty pending further investigation. He was removed from his position, placed on administrative leave, and the Navy launched an official inquiry into his conduct and potential civil rights violations. Sarah was interviewed one final time, and she was asked for her reaction to these revelations. "I'm not surprised," she said simply, "but I am sad, because the Admiral clearly came into this position with prejudices that had nothing to do with me or my work. He made assumptions about who I was before he ever met me. And when I performed my duties the way I always do, with competence and professionalism, it threatened his worldview. So rather than accept that his worldview might be wrong, he decided to attack me. She paused. I hope that the Navy uses this as an opportunity to examine its culture. Because discrimination, whether it's based on gender, race, or anything else, doesn't just hurt the people being discriminated against. It weakens the entire organization. It takes talented people and puts them in impossible positions. It creates resentment, and ultimately it costs lives. The reporter asking the questions looked moved. "What do you want to happen now?" she asked. Sarah thought about this for a moment. "I want the Admiral to face consequences for his actions. Not because I'm angry with him, but because people in positions of authority need to know that their prejudices have a cost. I want the Navy to do better. And I want young women who are considering military service to know that they have value here, that they can contribute, and that their voices matter." The investigation concluded 3 weeks later. Admiral Hargrove was formally reprimanded and forced to take a medical retirement. He received his full pension and benefits, which angered many people, but his career was effectively over. He issued a carefully worded statement through his lawyer saying that he was being misrepresented and that certain people were taking his personal writings out of context. But no one believed him. The Navy didn't, the media didn't, and the public certainly didn't. Sarah's vindication was complete. She was invited to meet with the new wing commander, a woman named Admiral Patricia Young, who had been brought in to replace Hargrove. Admiral Young was impressed with Sarah's record and her character. She offered to recommend Sarah for promotion to squadron commander, a position that would be a major step forward in her career. Sarah accepted, but she also requested a transfer to a base closer to her hometown of Monterey, California. She wanted to be near her aging parents. She wanted to rebuild her life outside of the immediate fallout from the incident. The Navy granted her request. 2 months after the incident in the auditorium, Sarah was cleared to transfer. She was given a ceremony where she was thanked for her service and her integrity. Medal citations were read. Her accomplishments were finally recognized without any asterisks or qualifications. She was praised as a role model for young officers, female and male alike. And through it all, Sarah remained composed and professional. She didn't gloat. She didn't take revenge beyond the simple fact of her vindication. She simply did what she always did. She moved forward. But inside, something had changed. She understood now more deeply than ever that truth had a way of emerging. That integrity mattered. And that sometimes the bravest thing you could do wasn't to stay silent or play along. 3 months later, Sarah was stationed at Naval Base Monterey, a smaller facility than Kingsville, but one that was closer to home. She had moved into a house overlooking the Monterey Bay, a place where she could watch the water and the ships coming and going. At night, she could see the lights of the fishing boats, and during the day, she could watch military helicopters practicing maneuvers over the bay. It was peaceful, it was healing. But peace comes with a price, and Sarah was learning that price in subtle ways. She received fewer social invitations. The other officers were respectful but distant. Some people, especially older men, seemed to resent her. In the coffee room one morning, she overheard someone say, "She made an entire Admiral fall. What kind of woman does that?" The tone suggested it was not a compliment. Online, the story had evolved. What had started as a straightforward narrative of a woman standing up to discrimination had become something more complicated. Some military blogs and forums discussed whether Sarah had violated protocol, whether she should have reported the Admiral through proper channels instead of confronting him publicly. Others questioned whether her competence was really as high as her record suggested, or whether she had inflated her achievements. It was a familiar pattern. Sarah had researched it, had read studies about women who spoke out against powerful men. The backlash was often worse than the original offense. People wanted to find reasons to diminish her, to suggest that maybe she was wrong or exaggerating, or that she had done something to provoke the Admiral. One evening, sitting in her house with a cup of tea, Sarah read an article in a military publication that particularly stung. The author, a retired admiral, had written a piece titled "The Cost of Calling Out Authority." In it, he suggested that while Hargrove's behavior was inappropriate, Sarah's response had been unnecessarily confrontational. He suggested that she could have handled it more diplomatically, that she had allowed her emotions to override her judgment. The article concluded with a line that Sarah found particularly troubling. We must ask ourselves whether the Navy's goal of diversity and inclusion is worth the price of undermining the chain of command. In other words, the question was being reframed. It wasn't about whether Hargrove was wrong. It was about whether Sarah was wrong for speaking out because her speaking out had consequences. Sarah closed the article and poured another cup of tea. She had expected this. She had known that standing up would come with costs, but knowing it intellectually and experiencing it emotionally were two different things. The real test came in May, during her first major operation from the Monterey base. Sarah was leading a training mission that involved coordination with pilots from a nearby Air Force base. It was a routine exercise, the kind that was done regularly to maintain readiness and ensure that different branches of the military could work together effectively. She had planned it carefully, briefed her pilots thoroughly, and was confident in the mission parameters. Everything was by the book. But when she arrived at the coordination meeting with the Air Force pilots, she noticed something strange. The Air Force commander, Colonel Michael Vasquez, seemed uncomfortable. He was professional but distant. When Sarah presented her plan, he questioned every aspect of it in a way that seemed excessive. "Are you sure about these approach vectors?" he asked. "Yes, sir. I've reviewed the data extensively." "Your record at Kingsville before the incident. There's some question about whether those numbers are accurate," he said, referring to her kill count. "So I want to make sure we're not taking unnecessary risks." The implication was clear. He was suggesting that Sarah's achievements, which had been officially recognized and investigated, might be unreliable, that the incident had cast doubt on her competence. Sarah felt heat rise in her chest, but she kept her voice level. "With respect, Colonel, my record has been reviewed by the Navy's investigation team and found to be accurate. And this mission is no different from dozens of similar training exercises. My proposed parameters are within all safety guidelines." Vasquez nodded slowly. "All right, we'll proceed as planned, but I'll be monitoring the mission personally." The operation went perfectly, every maneuver executed flawlessly, every objective achieved. Sarah brought all her pilots home safely, and the Air Force pilots reported no issues. But when she filed her after-action report, she included a note about Vasquez's questioning of her competence. She was careful to be factual, to quote his words accurately, to not make accusations. But she made it clear that she had witnessed what appeared to be bias. The response came from the commanding officer at Monterey, Admiral Young. She called Sarah into her office. "I read your after-action report," Admiral Young said, gesturing for Sarah to sit. "Yes, ma'am. I appreciate the professionalism with which you handled the Vasquez situation. But I want to give you some advice, one officer to another." Sarah waited. "You have a target on your back now," Admiral Young said bluntly. "Not because you did anything wrong, but because you made a powerful man fall. And there are a lot of people in this military who resent that. Some of them will be looking for any excuse to undermine you, to suggest that you're not reliable, or that you have an axe to grind, or that you're seeing discrimination where none exists." "But there was discrimination," Sarah said quietly. "I know, and everyone with any sense knows it. But that doesn't matter to some people. What matters is that you survived and the Admiral didn't, and that creates a certain kind of resentment." Admiral Young leaned forward. "My advice, don't mention bias unless you absolutely have to. Document everything, dates, times, exact words, but don't make accusations unless you have proof. Because every time you speak up, you're confirming in people's minds that you're the woman who took down an admiral. That becomes your identity, and it becomes a reason for people to mistrust you." Sarah felt something harden in her chest. The suggestion was clear: be quiet, don't make waves, accept the slights and the questioning because the alternative is to be seen as a troublemaker. "What happened to standing up for what's right?" Sarah asked, surprised at the bitterness in her own voice. "Nothing. Standing up for what's right is important. But sometimes you have to pick your battles. And sometimes the victory you win comes at a cost that extends far into the future." That night, sitting in her house overlooking the bay, Sarah thought about what Admiral Young had said. She thought about all the young female pilots who looked up to her. She thought about what message she would be sending if she started to quiet herself, to accept dismissal and doubt, to stop speaking up when she witnessed injustice. She also thought about the cost, the isolation, The resentment, the questions about her competence that had no basis in reality, but that wouldn't go away. This was the true price of standing up, Sarah realized. It wasn't the formal investigation or the public attention. It was the knowledge that no matter how thoroughly you had been vindicated, no matter how clearly wrong your accuser had been proven to be, there would always be people who questioned you, who wondered if maybe, just maybe, you had exaggerated or manipulated the situation or deserved what you got. Sarah made a decision that night. She would continue to do her job with the same excellence she always had. She would continue to stand up for what was right, but she would be smarter about it. She would document everything. She would build an unshakable record, and she would trust that in the end, truth had a way of winning out. Because if she stopped fighting, if she started to accept the idea that her achievements were somehow less real or less valid than those of male pilots, then Hargrove would have won. Not the investigation, not the official proceedings, but the real battle, the battle for her own sense of self-worth. A year and a half after the auditorium incident, Sarah received an invitation that surprised her. The Naval Academy, her alma mater in Annapolis, Maryland, wanted her to come give a speech during the graduation ceremony for the class of 2025. Sarah was honored but also nervous. Public speaking had never been her favorite thing. She preferred the clear, direct communication of flight operations to the sometimes murky world of giving talks and interviews. She called Admiral Young. "What do you think?" she asked. "Should I do it?" "Absolutely," Young said without hesitation. "This is exactly the kind of thing you should be doing. It's not political. It's not making accusations. You're just sharing your experience with young officers who are starting their careers." "There are still a lot of people who resent me," Sarah said. "There always will be," Young replied. "But there are also a lot of people who think you're brave and important, and you are." Sarah accepted the invitation. She spent weeks working on her speech, reading it out loud, refining it, trying to find the right words to say to a group of young sailors and officers who were about to embark on their military careers. The day of the graduation ceremony arrived in late May. It was a beautiful spring day in Annapolis. The entire brigade of midshipmen was assembled in Tecumseh Court, in their dress uniforms, families and supporters filling the surrounding areas. There was an energy in the air, the energy of young people who were about to become official members of the Navy and Marine Corps. Admiral Patricia Young introduced Sarah with warm words about her integrity and courage. Then Sarah walked to the podium. Looking out at the sea of young faces, roughly 40% of them female, she noticed with a small smile, Sarah felt her nervousness settle. These were her people, the next generation of officers, the future of the Navy. "When I graduated from this academy 20 years ago," Sarah began, "I had no idea what was coming. I knew I wanted to fly. I knew I wanted to serve. But I didn't know about the struggles I would face or the choices I would have to make or the moments when I would question whether I belonged here. I want to tell you something, and I want you to really hear it. When you join the Navy, you are joining an institution that is bigger than yourself, that is older than you are, and that has traditions and cultures that go very deep. Some of those traditions are beautiful. Some of them are worth preserving, but some of them are broken. Some of them are harmful. And you, the next generation of officers, will have to decide what to keep and what to change. About a year and a half ago, something happened in my career that forced me to confront this directly. A commanding officer made comments that were discriminatory and inappropriate, and I had a choice. I could let it go. I could accept it as just one of those things. I could tell myself that it was easier to stay quiet and not make waves. I chose to speak up, and I want to tell you honestly that it was one of the hardest things I've ever done. Because speaking up against authority, speaking up against tradition, speaking up against the way things have always been done, that comes with a cost. People question you. People doubt you. People find ways to undermine you and make your life harder. But I also want to tell you that it was one of the best things I've ever done, because the truth came out. The systems of accountability that exist in this institution actually worked, and the Navy became slightly better for it. Not completely better, not transformed, but better. So my advice to you is this: know what you stand for, know what you believe in, and when you encounter something that is wrong, something that violates the values that this institution is supposed to represent, don't stay quiet. Not recklessly, not without thinking about the consequences, but don't stay quiet. Because you are the future of this military. You are the ones who will set the tone for the next generation. And if you accept discrimination, if you accept inequality, if you accept leaders who make decisions based on prejudice rather than merit, then you are allowing those things to continue. I didn't do this alone. I had support from people who believed in me. I had senior officers who took my complaints seriously and investigated them thoroughly. I had a Navy that, for all its flaws, has systems of accountability that actually work when people use them. And I had this knowledge that I was right, not in an arrogant way, but in a factual way. My record spoke for itself. My accomplishments were real, my concerns were legitimate, and all I had to do was trust that truth would eventually win out. Will it be easy for you? No. Will there be people who resent you for standing up? Probably. But will you be able to look yourself in the mirror and know that you did the right thing? Yes, and that matters more than anything else. Sarah looked out at the young faces watching her. In conclusion, I want to tell you that the world is watching what you do. The Navy is watching. Your families are watching. And I'm watching because I care about whether the next generation of officers is going to be better than mine. You have the power to change things. You have the power to set a new standard. And you have the responsibility to use that power wisely. Thank you for your service, even though it hasn't begun yet, and welcome to the Navy. The applause was thunderous. As Sarah left the podium, she saw tears in the eyes of some of the young midshipmen, especially the women. She saw older officers applauding. She also saw a few people who remained silent, who watched her with expressions that were hard to read. After the ceremony, Sarah was surrounded by young officers and cadets wanting to shake her hand, to tell her that her speech had moved them, to ask her for advice about their own careers. One young woman, a second-class midshipman named Hannah Rodriguez, pulled Sarah aside. "Captain Chen, I just wanted to say, what you did standing up to that Admiral, that gave me courage. I thought about quitting the academy last year because I didn't think I belonged here. But I heard about what happened to you and how you didn't back down, and I decided to stay, so thank you." Sarah looked at this young woman, probably no more than 20 years old, with her whole Navy career ahead of her, and she felt something inside her that had been broken by the past year and a half start to heal. "Thank you for staying," Sarah said, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. That evening, at the graduation dinner, Sarah was seated at a table with several senior Navy officers, including Vice Admiral Thomas Richardson, who was the superintendent of the Naval Academy. He was older, in his early 60s, and had a distinguished career spanning 4 decades. "That was a remarkable speech," he said to Sarah as they ate. "Thank you, sir. I want to tell you something," he continued, leaning forward slightly. "When the Hargrove situation first came to light, I wasn't sure how it was going to play out. I knew he was wrong, but I also knew that speaking up against him would be difficult for you. But what I didn't anticipate was the positive impact it would have on the entire institution. Do you know how many reports of sexual harassment and discrimination we've received since that incident became public?" "No, sir," Sarah said. 347. In 1 year. From people who had been silent before because they didn't think anyone would listen, or they didn't think it would matter, or they were afraid of retaliation. He paused. 347 people found their voice because you found yours. And because of those reports, we've identified patterns of abuse that had been going on for years. We've fired or forced to retire 7 officers who were engaged in harassment or discrimination. We've implemented new training programs. We've created better reporting mechanisms. The point is, Vice Admiral Richardson continued, that your courage didn't just affect you. It had a ripple effect through the entire institution, so I want to thank you for that, and I want you to know that what you did mattered. After the dinner, Sarah walked through the academy grounds, the same grounds where she had walked as a young midshipman 20 years earlier. She thought about how much had changed, how much she had changed, how much the Navy had changed because of her willingness to stand up and be counted. She also thought about Admiral Hargrove. She had heard that he had struggled since his forced retirement. He had developed health problems. His marriage, which had apparently been rocky for years, had ended in divorce. He had become somewhat of a pariah in military circles. Sarah didn't feel satisfied by this. Vindication wasn't as sweet as she had thought it would be. Instead, she felt sad. Sad that a man who had been accomplished and capable had let his prejudices destroy his career. Sad that he had never been able to see past his own limitations and biases. But she also didn't regret what she had done. Because the alternative, silence, acceptance, the slow erosion of her own self-respect, was worse. 3 months later, Sarah received a letter. It had been forwarded to her through official Navy channels, and it had a return address that she almost didn't open. It was from Admiral James Hargrove. Dear Captain Chen, I'm writing to you because I've had a lot of time to think about what happened, and I've come to some realizations that I should have come to earlier. I was wrong, not just wrong in the sense that I behaved unprofessionally, but wrong in the ways I viewed you and the women under my command. I was clinging to an outdated view of the military, and I was threatened by people like you who challenged that view. I won't ask for your forgiveness. I don't deserve it, and it's not mine to ask for. But I wanted you to know that I've been working with a therapist, trying to understand why I was so resistant to change, why I was so defensive when my authority was questioned. I've also become aware of the scope of the complaints that came out after my removal. I've read some of the accounts of the women I supervised, and I'm ashamed, deeply ashamed. Your speech at the Naval Academy, they sent me a copy, was extraordinary. You were gracious in victory. You didn't use the platform to attack me or to say, I told you so. You used it to inspire the next generation to do better than I did. I'm not sure I would have had that kind of grace in your position. I hope that someday, the Navy that you're helping to build will be better than the one I helped to lead. I hope that young women will have the opportunity to serve without facing the kind of discrimination that you faced. And I hope that, in some small way, my failure has contributed to that outcome. Respectfully, Admiral James Hargrove. Sarah read the letter 3 times. She wasn't sure how to feel about it. Part of her wanted to dismiss it as meaningless words from a man who had lost everything. Part of her recognized the genuine remorse in the letter, the evidence of real self-reflection and growth. In the end, she decided that the letter didn't matter as much as what it represented. It represented the possibility that even people who are deeply wrong can, eventually, recognize their wrongness and change. It represented the idea that accountability, real accountability, sometimes leads to transformation. She filed the letter away in a safe place, not because she forgave him, but because she wanted to remember it. Because on the days when speaking up felt too hard, when the cost seemed too high, when the isolation and the doubt seemed unbearable, she wanted to remember that change was possible. That truth could overcome lies. That integrity could triumph, even when the battle was long and difficult. Sarah had grown beyond the incident now. She had been promoted to squadron commander, a position she had earned through excellence and competence. She had trained a new generation of pilots, many of them young women who were learning that they could be brave and professional at the same time. She had written articles for military publications about leadership and ethics. She had been invited to speak at military academies and training programs. She had also learned to accept the cost. The resentment from some quarters would probably never go away. There would always be people who questioned her, who suggested that her achievements were somehow less valid, who looked for ways to undermine her. But there would also be young officers who had found their courage because of her example. There would be women who had come forward with their own stories of discrimination, because the Navy had shown that those stories could lead to real change. There would be a Navy that was slightly more just, slightly more fair, slightly more willing to listen to the voices of people it had previously ignored. On a clear evening in September, Sarah stood on the deck of the USS Ronald Reagan, a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier where she was serving as the senior pilot coordinator for a deployment. The sun was setting over the Pacific Ocean, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Below her, the flight deck gleamed in the fading light. Helicopters were being secured for the night. Young sailors were conducting their final checks before standing down for the day. Sarah thought about the young midshipman, Hannah Rodriguez, who had told her that she was the reason she had stayed in the academy. Hannah was now a second-class midshipman on track to graduate in 2 years. She was going to be a pilot, just like Sarah. She thought about the 347 people who had come forward with complaints of discrimination and harassment, whose voices had been heard because the institution had been forced to listen. She thought about the systems of accountability that actually worked when you trusted them to work. She thought about the cost of standing up and the cost of staying silent, and the knowledge that one was worth paying and the other was not. The joke about her kill count had been meant to diminish her, to reduce her to a number, to make her smaller than she was. Instead, it had led to her becoming bigger. Bigger not in the sense of more powerful or more important, but bigger in the sense of more real, more true, more authentic. And on that aircraft carrier, as the sun set and the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Captain Sarah Chen allowed herself a small, private smile. She had won, not completely, not perfectly, not in every way that mattered, but she had won. And more importantly, she had survived. She had stood up and spoken truth to power, and she had survived. And the Navy, for all its flaws and its problems, had done the right thing.